something that I says that sparks an interest, I want you to do it. Because I have an agenda where I want to go today, but oftentimes when I speak, I find out that there's something even bigger that I didn't even know. And if that's where it takes us, that's where it takes us. But for the sake of today, we wanted to talk about accessing quality health care. Accessing quality health care for everybody. So when we think about this, as David alluded to, for the past 2.5 years, I was a team psychologist for the Milwaukee Bucks. And one of my major job duties was helping to work with the draft. And in working with the draft, you have these young men, they're a little nervous, they're a little scared when they come, but you're trying to figure out what kind of person are they? Is this a good person? Is this a person who will fit inside of the culture of our team? And so, we have those kind of like Rorschach tests, those different personalities tests. And so, but the main thing what I was looking for is not if a person had been hurt and abused, but their ability to be resilient and to recover. So I had 3 things that I look for when I asked them questions. What was going on with their past? What are they doing currently? And what were their hopes for the future? Because when you think about mental health, everything is about that emotional wellness. But the sad part about mental health is most times when people think about mental health, they think about mental illness. And so that's why it's so taboo. Nobody wants to talk about it. I'm sure some people saw that on the table. We're talking about mental health. No, thank you. We don't want to deal with it because it's so taboo, regardless of what culture. But what we have to try to do to try to normalize this is we have to look at it as mental health on this equilibrium, on this continuum. We have mental illness and you have mental wellness. Unfortunately, in our society, we always look at things very reactive. We wait till there's a problem and then we try to attack it. And that's why with mental health, it's always very difficult because we're now looking at dealing with a problem that could have been prevented. I was laughing at David a little bit earlier. He said he was catching the elevator up. He said, walk them steps. I got my little Fitbit. I'm up to 17 stairs already, 17 flights. I said, I have a lot of work in this building. But what it is that when I work out, you know what it does? It makes me feel good because you know what it does? It doesn't just make me feel good mentally, but I'm talking about from a neurobiological level. What it is you have these endorphins. Sometimes you refer to it as adrenaline, but it releases these great feelings inside your body so you feel good. Sometimes you're a little out of breath, let you know maybe you need to do a little work to get in shape. But what I'm saying is this, the more we stay on this mental wellness continuum, the less likely we are to be on a mental illness. Now this is the sad part and one of the reasons why I'm so happy to speak here, because oftentimes when we talk about America, we start talking about capitalism. And the old saying is if it makes dollars, it makes sense. So from a mental health perspective, it's not about a curative, but it's more about palliative. And that's unfortunate because there's 2 rules that's kind of stated in the profession where I work. And specifically a little bit higher up when you deal with psychiatrists who start to deal on medication. They said number 1 is don't kill them. Number 2, don't cure them. If I kill you, you're dead. I can't profit off of you. If you cure it, I can't profit off of you. You're living, but I can't profit. So what I need to do is just to keep you somewhat reliant on dealing with what's going on. So the first thing what I want you to think about is this. We all have mental health issues. Sometimes on that illness continuum, sometimes on that wellness. There's very few people who are so relegated to that illness side that they need help. But our society has created this culture of mental health where we frighten people. As a psychologist, we use a book called the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Statistics Manual of Disorders. When it was first created in 1952, it had 130 pages, roughly 112 disorders. They just did the 5th edition of it in roughly 2014. It's now up to 830 pages. Because it said for every ill, there's a pill. Now look at it from an insurance standpoint. If you want to take your child, if you want to take your spouse in for insurance, if there's nothing wrong, the insurance company won't cover you. Because the only way they'll cover you is if you have a diagnosed label under the DSM-5. So they had to keep creating these labels to bring people in. So now we talk about, we have a lot of people who want to come into the mental health system. There's issues going on. What do I do? Where do I access this service? How do I get it? Can I trust the people who are there? And this is the beautiful part about it. A lot of the people who I work with, a lot of my colleagues, I know their hearts. Their hearts are beautiful. Their hearts are pure. Their hearts are good. They want to help. But I'm going to tell you what the problem is. A lot of the problem comes in the way we're taught. Because like I told you, it's always from this illness standpoint. It's always from this retroactive standpoint. Let's wait until it's broken. Let's wait until it's broke to try to fix it. So now I think about our teaching system, because this is where it all begins. You can only really teach what you're taught, what you know. So we're taught from time and time and time again, you're trained, you're given all of this information. If a person has an illness, we do this here. But think about it. If you have a broken arm, how do you know you have a broken arm when you go to the doctor? What ocular proof do they have for you that you know? It's an x-ray. And you can clearly see that that bone is severed, correct? If you have a tumor, they can show you, whether it's through a CAT scan, an MRI or something, that that tumor is clearly there. But now think about it from a mental health issue. How can you really, from a biological, from a medical, ocular proof state, someone has ADHD, that someone has depression, that someone has anxiety? You can't. So it becomes a guessing game. And when we're guessing, what's one of the ways in which we cure? Well, yes, we have therapy, but another thing that we have is what? Pills, medication. And because it's not an exact science, what happens when individuals get a pill? Ooh, I'm allergic to this. Ooh, this doesn't work. It becomes a system. And unfortunately, these pills, even though they can have great benefits in the beginning, it's just like any other drug. Our body either what happens when you drink your first beer?
To get tipsy?
You get tipsy. But after you done drunk that one beer about 5 times, what happens with the one beer? It doesn't have the same effect. So what do you have to do? You increase it, you increase it, you increase it. Same things happens with the medication. The only thing, just like with the alcohol, there's these side effects. And so it's just like, what's one of the remedies for a hangover?
Another beer.
What is it? It's a pill for the pill. So when we look at this, y'all gotta loosen up. We're gonna have fun with this. This is mental health, but this is not that stuffy type of thing. This is what I want you to understand. So now when you have individuals, this is all we've been trained, this is how we do. It's not an exact science, so when we're diagnosing you, it's a bit of a fishing expedition. Now, it's not quite so loose, but at the end, sometimes, for example, I can give you this specific example. One of the places I worked at was the Wisconsin Department of Corrections. We were sued. You know why we were sued by an inmate? Because the psychiatrist gave him one diagnosis, the psychologist gave him another diagnosis. Now, it wasn't the fact that both of these diagnoses was kind of true, but it was the fact that these people who were working in the same building, supposedly having these multi-collaborative support team meetings, weren't on the same page. That's where the lawsuit came in. But the thing was, in which they tried to argue was, different diagnosis, different people can look at different stages and different things. This can be true and this can be true. And they said that could be correct. So it wasn't that they had different diagnoses for the same exact person, it was that they weren't on the same page. So that lets us know it's not an exact science. So the way that we are taught has so much to do with it. Now, one of the reasons why we're here specifically, we're talking about Black History Month. Now, I want you to think about it. If mental health is taboo among all subjects, among all populations, if mental health is kind of a fishing expedition, think about how it gets more tricky when we start to add more differences in. And I'm talking specifically about the clinicians, the therapists, the psychotherapists, the psychologists. When that psychologist and that therapist doesn't quite look like you, doesn't come from the same place where you come from, they can have the best of hearts, the best of intentions, but it's not as much there to grasp from. And you'll be amazed at the little things that happen. Let me ask you a question here. How many of you watched the New Edition biography, epic on BET 3 weeks ago? Okay.
I'm only gonna know what New Edition is.
Now, why do I say that? Because that sounds so simple.
Doing that stuff. Listen to you.
Hey, well, you know what? My daughter's a new fan of it now. I'm seeing a Candy Girl. I don't know what to do. But what the point is this: if I'm a clinician, see, what I'm looking for is every avenue, every angle in which I can relate to you and I can talk to you. Now, see, as a clinician, I can talk about New Edition because you know what I saw in that movie? I saw 5 little black boys from the ghetto of Boston. None of them were the daddy's president in their life, getting ripped out from country, being very misogynistic in their ways, seeing that they had the motivation to do well, But you know what? It was just some other things I was missing. But if I got a client who's singing that with me, there's some ways I can reach him. So let me ask you this. There's another great show that I watch on television. It's called This Is Us. How many have seen that? One of the new best shows on television. It's about transracial adoption and all of the consequences that come up with it. And what we said, it doesn't matter. Sometimes people can have the heart, can have the love. With a young black boy who's adopted by this loving white couple who loves him to death, would do anything for him, treats him exactly like the other children, it's still some things they couldn't give him, so they find surrogate friends to be able to help him to understand his culture. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's just differences. Doesn't mean it's a deficit, doesn't mean it's bad. But now when we talk about it from a mental health perspective, what's the number one reason why therapy works? Does anybody know? The number one reason why therapy works in any setting is something we call rapport. The faith that I have in the person who I'm talking to. If I like you, if I believe in you, I believe you care, I believe you have compassion, I believe you're competent, then you know what? I'm going to buy into the things that you say even more. I'm going to buy into this. I'm going to enact these strategies. I'm going to feel empowered by it. But now what happens if I don't think you really care? What happens when I think maybe you have strategies, but those strategies really aren't the best for me? We see it in our schools all the time. We see great teachers in the education system. But yet when they get into some of the classrooms, they have difficulty. Great book. You write notes? Star Teachers by a man named Marty Haberman. Great professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, has since passed away. He said, we do a great disservice to our teachers. He said, we teach them to swim in the university swimming pool, and then we throw them into the English Channel. So I want you to think about this from a curriculum and instruction, from a pedagogical standpoint. He said what we're doing, we're giving them the nuts and bolts. They understand what it is to set up a curriculum, how to instruct them. They're swimming in a swimming pool, but if you've ever swum in a university swimming pool, what's the conditions like? They're perfect. You know, you get out, it's warm. You know, the current is right there. Some of them, the pools are only 4 feet, so if you get tired, you can just walk. But now compare that to the English Channel, and you'll understand the metaphor in which he's saying. And I submit for your consideration the same issues that our teachers have in the classrooms, a lot of our psychologists, our therapists have inside of their offices when they work with a lot of clients. And that's why we have the high rates of attrition. Attrition is when a person comes and then they don't come back. Because you know what? The rapport wasn't there. I don't have faith in you. I don't have confidence in you. I don't even know if you really like me. I don't even really know if you care. I don't know if I just feel like a paycheck. When I was in school, I went to a school. I grew up in the infamous Tim, where's Tim at? 53206, Mr. 53206 himself. I grew up there. Right across the street was my school. My teacher could literally look out the window if I was acting up and say, do I gotta call your grandma? And my grandma would be sitting right on the porch, just waiting to see. And so, no, I had that love from my first grade, second grade, fourth grade teacher. But when I got to the 5th grade, I heard something I had never heard before. And this was the first time that I had a white teacher. Now, in the 5th grade, all black teachers. We were unruly, we were disruptive, we were disrespectful. She would cry, we would laugh. That was our goal, to make her cry. Because when she cried, we didn't have to do work. It'd be just everybody put your head on the desk and be quiet. But one time she said, you know what? You put your head on your desk. I don't care if you learn. I'm going to get paid anyway. I could care less. I was happy I didn't have to work. But just on a humbug, I went home and I told my grandmother. And I told my grandmother told my mother, who then had a conversation with the teacher, and then they allowed me to understand what that meant. And at that time in my young, impressionable mind, I generalized this one white lady to a whole population of white people. So now what I want you to think about when you talk about African Americans and mental health, you talk about a school system that doesn't prepare not only the white students, the black students also. So even when a black therapist goes in with a black person, they're still in the same dilemma. But now in combination to that, if you're not a black therapist and you're not in tune with the culture, now you're dealing with those demographic issues that separate you further. And so we wonder why mental health doesn't work from an African American perspective sometimes. But now I want you to think about this. Give you a little history lesson if I can. You've all heard of the nature-nurture debate? Somebody explain what that is in quick terms. And I ain't gonna have me talk. No. All right, that's easy. That's an easy one. Come on, let me give you this fastball.
It seems like softball, but all right. So there you go. Well, nature is genetic. So what parts of our personality come from our genes? What parts of our abilities come from our genes? Nurture is the investment in the child. So how much do we put into helping that child? What kind of money? What kind of effort? What kind of parental structure? All the different things that go into raising that child. It's a debate because there's some people that believe that, and there's been different theories that nature is more important than nurture more important than nature, and I think now the consensus is that really it's interrelated with both, and one really isn't successful without the other.
So we hear nature and nurture. Has anybody in here ever heard the term epigenetic? Epi meaning over from the Greek, genetics meaning over genetics. So when we talk about nature and nurture, that nature is that pure biology, that DNA that we're talking about. We talk about, you go to the doctor, they say, well, what's your family history? Do you have a genetic predisposition for that, things of that nature? Nurture, as you so eloquently said, this is our outside environment, where we grew up, where we lived in, the amount of love that was poured in us, all of these great things like that. So I want you to think about this. Now, epigenetics is this. What are those things over our genetics that's been transcribed from our family? That means things that my father went through, that I never went through, but that was brought into me from that that nurture standpoint, and nature is a combination of those two things that lasted generations. This is probably the most important thing that I can give you for those of you who are taking notes. How many of you have heard of the ACE study? Raise your hand. Okay, ACE stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences. And I want you to think about this. Because with adverse childhood experiences, this was something that was done by Kaiser Permanente and the CDC back in 1995. They said, this was a funny thing. They were doing this study on ladies who were overweight. They were trying to figure out what it was. And what they found out is they all had a common denominator of a sexual abuse in their history. And it was like, oh wow, you're telling me something that happened in the past has affected their health in this standpoint? So they said, let's do some more research. So they created this study, 10 questions. And what they looked at was physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. So you had a combination of nature, nurture thing, but it was also, was there mental health issues in my family? Was there a divorce? Did I see domestic violence? Was somebody in prison? Was somebody dead, taken away? So they had these 10 questions based on these questions. And if you scored over a 4, what they realized is that as you got older, you had a higher prevalence of health issues. I'm talking about heart issues. I'm talking about cancer. I'm talking about ulcers. You had mental health issues. You had overdependence on addictions, on opiates, on other drugs, things of that nature. Now, when they did the study, the average age of the person was about 55. 70% of the studies were from Southern, all of the population was from Southern California. Over 70% was white. So now what I want you to think about is this. With these ACE studies, with people over 80%, over 65% were college educated. So now we have intelligent people, have a great source of income, have insurance, things of these nature, things to be able to deal with these mental health issues, but yet they still had these problems. Now what I want you to do is to think about a young black boy, a young black girl, in some of our stereotypical communities that we hear about. And think about the situations that they go through. Think about what their ACE score is. Mine was a 7. Judge, I grew up in 53206, and 53206, when I grew up, was not the 53206 that's kind of shown about right now. So the question becomes, if we have these ACEs, And they lead to these issues later in life. Well, what are we going to do? What do we have to do? Well, everybody says, well, we need mental health. We need mental health. So people bring their sons and their daughters in the meeting and say, help them. This is the hard part about this right now. What's the hard part? Because when people come in, they have a multitude of issues. And they want 50 years of issues to be resolved in 2 weeks, 3 months, 6 months. In brief therapy, there used to be a time where you only got 8 sessions from your insurance. 8 sessions. So now, let's go back to our African American child. I want you to think about nature, I want you to think about nurture, I want you to think about epigenetics. Thinking about if most of the people who I'm working with, very few look like me. I worked at Children's Hospital, and I worked at the Department of Corrections, and I worked in the NBA. When I was at the Department of Corrections, I was the only black person ever to work in any of the buildings that I worked in. And then when we did it statewide, it was probably about a handful of us. When I worked inside of MPS as a school psychologist, it was over 140, 3 black men, 12 psychologists altogether. When I worked at the hospital, at Children's Hospital, who is one of the best places in the world to go to, I was the only one. We're the number 3 hospital in the nation. Number 4, depending on the year, but we were always perennially top 5. These issues. So now, thinking about the African American child, they come in. But I want you to think about all of the issues that they come in with. Now, we talked about those ACE studies. I have a parent on drug. I had a parent who abused me. I had an uncle who sexually abused me. I had people who neglected me. I had one parent in the home. I was in foster care, all of these things. But now what I want you to add on is this, because a lot of times we see our young people, we say, these thugs, these savages, these criminals, we need to build these prisons. And I will agree with you, some of the behavior that we see in our young people is absolutely unacceptable. We need to do something to stop it. But this is the one thing I would like to submit for your consideration. Before we just punish and ostracize the monstrous behavior, can we consider the situation that helped to create it? Now, America, especially when we talk about Black History Month, it always begins in Jamestown, Virginia for us. 1619, they talk about that's when the first Africans were brought in here. They call our ancestors slaves. Problem number 1. We're talking about human trafficking these days. How many people call pimps masters with legal rights to these young women and men? None of us. Because it's atrocious what's going on. We understand that. But for those people who participated in the Middle Passage, the transatlantic slave trade, these were the slave masters, and they brought in slaves. So now what I want you to remember is this epigenetic. Remember this stuff that's over the genetics, things that's transferred from generation to generation. Being stolen away from your country, being ripped from your name, being ripped from your religion, being ripped from everything that you know, being placed in these horrific situations, not knowing where you're going. If you've ever seen these ships that they were transported in, you know there was something horrible, unlivable, worse than what we would even want for our criminals today. So now you take this, and really, we say 1619, but there's periods all the way to 1503 and 1508 that show Africans that were kidnapped, brought into the Americas. So now you're dealing with that, and we go through this long history of our period of an ill that they call slavery. I think is much more worse than criminal. It ends, supposedly, in 1865. Emancipation Proclamation was signed September of 1862, supposedly going in order in January 1st, 1863. However, the Civil War didn't end until 1865. So you have these years of individuals who have trauma, who have hurt, who have resentment. This is brought on from generation to generation to generation. Now, from the period basically from 1865 to 1899, although it wasn't great for black people, there's a period that we call the Reconstruction period. And if you look in that period of time, although we had things like convict leasing and we had these black codes that still relegated career shopping, that relegated blacks to second-class citizens, there were some opportunities for blacks at that time. That's why when you see senators, the first elected governor of America was who? One of y'all better know this. L. Douglas Wilder in Virginia, first elected, but the first ever governor is, that's your homework, I'm not doing it for you, find out. It was a lieutenant governor with the initials of OJ, H. Oscar James. Something happened with the governor. I'll leave that to you for a homework assignment if you really want to know. But the point is what I'm saying is during this Reconstruction period, it was that kind of period of hope where you saw maybe a glimpse that, you know what, that more perfect union, those things that they had talked about kind of striving for could be. But what happened in 1899? Plessy versus Ferguson, anybody familiar with that? What's another name for Plessy versus Ferguson? When we talk about the Jim Crow era. So what, that's separate, but what? Equal. Was everything equal? No. Okay, so think about now what this does to your mind. Crispus Attucks, this great hero, said, hey, if you guys fight over here for us as we try to defeat the British, we're gonna give you freedom. You know what, if you fight for us in the Civil War, guess what? We're gonna give you freedom. Reconstruction, okay, well, you know what? Y'all free, you go your way, we're gonna be separate. That's cool, but it's gonna be equal. It's not equal, lie after lie after lie. How many of us laughed at Charlie Brown for being so silly? Every time Lucy put the ball down, and we know she's gonna move it, but she has an uncanny ability to make these alternative facts come to life. And to let Charlie Brown know what? I'm gonna hold this ball. As soon as he puts his trust in it, it's wiped away again. So we take this whole era all the way from Plessy versus Ferguson to Jim Crow, all the way up to the Civil Rights Movement. You talk about the works of Lyndon B. Johnson after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. We say, you know what, there's gonna be equal rights, and you know what, things got better. They did get better. They're not where they need to be, but nobody can say that life quantitatively is much better for me than it was for my ancestors that lived in the 18th and 19th century. Definitely. But it's still not where it needs to be. But now what I want you to think about, though, is all the thing that's transcribed into this African-American mind. And black people are not a homogeneous group. It's not a monolithic culture. So we want to get this straight. But when we talk about it as a whole, I'm very comfortable with saying this. So now we go to the Civil Rights Movement. And now we start to get what? It's an empowerment. We are equal. We are citizens of this country. And you start to see factions come up. People like Medgar Evers, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, parties like the NAACP, Urban League are now kind of, you know, they're ramped up. They've been going on for a while. We see revolutionaries like H. Rap Brown, like Stokely Carmichael, Fred Hampton. What happened to a lot of these organizations and individuals?
Shot.
They were killed, assassinated. So what do you think that does for the mind of a person who wants to do something great for his people? It's always that fear. Whether it's Black Wall Street on Oklahoma saying, hey, we're gonna be separate, but as soon as we start to prosper, you tear us down. Well, you know what? We don't wanna hurt you, we just wanna be independent on our own. And I want you to think about this from an epigenetic standpoint. I want you to think about it nature, nurture, and everything that we do. So now we go up. Things are pretty good. I live in the city of Milwaukee. I told you I grew up in 53206. We actually grew up in multiple districts, but 53206 is where I stayed till I was 11 years old. My dad worked in an industrial plant called Ramel Smith. I remember my mom, my sister would get in the car, we'd pick them up, and you see all of these men coming out. You know, they got the lunch bags, they got their hard hats. For a young boy, that's just what a man looked like. You know, it was something powerful. In the 70s, black men had the best opportunity in the city of Milwaukee. Our employment rate was 73% compared to whites at 84%, which was pretty good. You said, this is a good place to go. My grandparents never graduated from college. My parents never went to college. But it was that chance of the American dream that my posterity, my future generations after me could go to the next level. And you saw some hope. But what happened? It's a combination of multiple things that we have to look at. And this is now we're getting to the crux of everything here. You said, what does this have to do with mental health and where are you going with this? Well, now we have a combination of things. because we started to see the prison industrial complex move up. Now we start to see the deterioration of homes and neighborhoods and community. Now we start to see drugs introduced into our community in a way like they've never been done before. And now these drugs, which should have probably been looked at as a public health concern, was looked at in what way? Criminal. So now you add deindustrialization, you add prison industrial complex, but this is another thing where it's just not Black history, but it goes into everything. What started happening to our foods that we ate? You start talking about these GMOs. Now let's start talking about the things that we breathe, just the normal chemicals that they use to clean this beautiful table. Has something called regulatory capture. Because see, I'm not an enemy of capitalism in its purest sense, but I am an enemy of capitalism because capitalism is inherently greedy. And if it's unchecked, uncontrolled, now you have venture capitalists, now you have income inequality, which causes a lot of issues along the masses. So now you put all of these things in there, you put all of these things, you group them together. You start to have what? Individuals who have issues. Now we already had issues in schools. So now the young people have issues in schools. Now the homes are not there. Now we have drugs introduced. Now we have limited opportunity for what we call livable income. And now what we start to create, we start to create that monster. We start to create that type of behavior, that person that we're afraid of. When they talk about social engineering, this is what it has all to do with. And so this is where I need you all to really get thinking, to be like really, really on top of it. Because when David first asked me to come, I was like, I'm not coming. Like, they don't listen. What do you want to do? And I'm talking about some of the Black ones too. I'm not talking about the white ones. I'm saying, I didn't have any faith, but I said, you know what? If I don't come and talk and share the things I have, I'm part of the problem too. So I said, let me put the pressure on you. Because now when we started to talk about regulatory capture, and I'm talking about the EPA, I'm talking about the FDA, the USDA, the CDC, I'm talking about all of these places that are supposed to regulate and protect us as a community, they're bought out. Big tobacco, big pharma, they now control the show. So the ways in which we were protected were now harmed. And so not only is it an issue of mental health with Black Americans, but it's an issue with white Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, our people of our First Nation. It's an epidemic, it's a pandemic that's going around every place. So when we start to look at why should we care about accessible quality health care, there's a couple of things where I want you to look at. Black people usually didn't trust the system, epigenetics, nature, nurture, history, because it abused us. We were the guinea pigs. We were the canaries in the coal mine. You know what the canary in the coal mine represents? For those of you who don't know, when the coal miners were down, they were digging, there's a lot of carbon monoxide, which could kill them. So they would send a canary out. If the canary died, they knew, oh, danger. If it lived, hey, we can go a little further. Well, Black people have always felt like the canary to this place. So when there's a medication to be used, hey, put it on them, let them see. You know why Black people didn't want medication? Because when they first put out medication, kids were like this. Drooling. And we were afraid of it for something that could have possibly been beneficial. We saw how it's not used, but how it's misused and abused. But now, like I said, this is not only for Black individuals. We talk about it specifically because it's here, but what this is an issue that affects all of us. Every constituent that you have, whether it's urban, suburban, or rural. So you said, why is it necessary for me to come here? Because it is what affects one will eventually trickle down and affect others. I say it now, and I say it with the utmost respect. Rick Godot. Do we understand why I said that name with such great respect and veneration? Because he was the senator from Fond du Lac, 48-year-old, who killed himself. Who this? Who this? This is something that affects all of us. It doesn't matter your age. It doesn't matter your color. When I talked about those ACEs and the first being in San Diego, we all have this trauma. We all have regular trauma. Right now, if I went to a psychologist, they would say I was depressed. Maybe even clinically. You know why? Because my father-in-law just passed. My wife is having a tremendous, difficult time dealing with that. So it affects her, it affects my mother-in-law, it affects our home. So, it's two things that we can do. We could run to the doctor and get pills that probably will make the problem worse. Or, you know what we can do? We could band together as a family and try to make sure that all of this difficult time, it doesn't pull us apart, but it makes us stronger. So, in everything that we do, when people grieve, what usually happens? More drug use, because what we want to pacify, we want to get rid of this pain, comfort food, all of these other things that's not good for us. So when we start thinking about mental health, what I want you to think about when we assess mental health, looking at the ACE study now, so this is empirical data, we understand that mental health issues are these trauma situations that happen, that we all go through. It affects not only our mental health, but our physical health. And some of the remedies that we have for physical health and mental health seem to be counterproductive. Just sending a person to a psychologist is not going to help them at all. It's about what are the other things that we're doing. So when I talk about the foods that we eat, these foods contribute to it. When we look at our children, we look at the respiratory issues, we look at the high diabetes, the high cholesterol. These are things that are ingested by everybody. I was playing with somebody the other day, and they was like, "Where you going?" I said, "I'm going to the death box." They were like, "What you mean?" I said, "Over to McDonald's." There's death in that food. Let's be honest. Let's be real. That's not the McDonald's that the McDonald's brothers created. But you know why I go to McDonald's? Because it's a drug and I'm addicted. It tastes good. I know it's not good for me, but it tastes good. It do. But these are the things too that leads to the detrimental effects on my physical health and my mental health. So now as we talk about this, if I had just normal trauma as a regular person, but then as an African American, I started to deal with other different traumas from the past that I just have built within my system. And now I'm dealing with extra trauma from a community, from the government, from every place where I go. As a kid, I'm placed in special education. I'm told that I have this learning disorder, I have this. I go to this place, they tell me I'm not good enough. When I'm crying out for help, they further punish me. I've worked as a paraprofessional, as a special education teacher. I worked for St. Charles Youth and Family Services. I did my internship, or my interns at Ethan Allen and Southern Oaks Girls School. I went on to work for Milwaukee Secure Detention Facility. I went on to work for Children's Hospital, and then I went on to work for the Milwaukee Bucks. So I've been in every situation that you can think about. Even with the Milwaukee Bucks, I want you to see the line of succession that I saw. When I saw the special ed kids, they matriculated to St. Charles Youth and Family Services. The one from St. Charles Youth and Family Service, they graduated with me over to RYAC, Racine Youth for Offender Correctional Facility. They graduated over with me to where? To Milwaukee Secure Detention Facility. With that mid-stop of special education on the way, guess what? Some of these lucky ones, they get to make it to the NBA. Now that's a handful. So we think, once I've got all of this money, and even though I work for the Milwaukee Bucks, I want you to realize that the NBA is a brotherhood. So if you work for one team, you interact with just about everybody. And on some different levels, especially when they find out you do. You know, you find out somebody's a psychologist or a dentist or a plumber and you got a need for it, you want to call them. So I got to hear a lot of stories. And I'm not just talking about from current players. I'm talking from past players. Where even once they reach the heights that everybody think once if I get to this, everything is going to be okay, it still crumbled down because of the ill effects that weren't dealt with. And so what I'm saying is this. We look at it from a palliative effect instead of a curative. If we're going to work with mental health, and this is regardless of the demographic, we have to understand that this has to be a holistic approach. It can't be from the cradle to the grave. It has to be in utero to the grave. So when we start thinking about on the hill, when you start thinking about all of the things you can do, ask yourself, how am I really setting up my constituents? How am I really advocating for maybe even people who aren't in my district? Because the needs from suburban America to urban America to rural America are very different. But at the end of it, we can say white people, black people, Hispanic people, Asian people. What's the common denominator? People. See, we use some of these false demographics to separate us. Because if you really want to know who's superior in this room, you know who's superior? If your blood type is O negative. Because you can give blood to everybody. but you can't get blood from anybody but what? O negative. But if you AB plus, you get blood from anybody, but you can't give it to anybody but an AB plus. See, we always separate on foolish things, but none of the stuff that matters. And so what I'm trying to tell you is this: there's a book, and some of you maybe heard of it. You can pass it around, look at it. It's about a man named Willie Lynch, and they just put it in book form. Now here he is, trying to show these slave masters how to control their slaves. He said, if you perform this, I can guarantee you that for the next 300 years, you will have total mastery and control of your slaves. He said, whatever difference you find, you magnify it. Put the man versus the woman, the young versus the old, the light versus the dark. Whatever thing you can do, you do it. And if you can do that, if you can implement that with a certain type of fear where they are afraid to their life, they will ride lock and step with you. Now, before, when I was in college, there's no way I would have been in this room because I was so militant. I didn't want to talk to a white person because I didn't think anybody would listen. I didn't even think it was worthwhile. But as you grow, and as you mature, and you start to understand, you say, you know what? It's not about color. Because I done met great people from every color. I met some bad people of every color. Met some good people of every gender. Some bad people of every gender. Good people of every profession, bad people of every profession. So when you think about this, now we say, how can we not let the masses separate us? Because Willie Lynch wasn't just talking to the slave owners. If you read the works of Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, here's some things that they talk about the masters of mankind. That top elite that wants to rule everything. Well, they really enacted the Willie Lynch on society. Look at us now. We fight about borders, about keeping people in and out. We fight within society, putting the blacks versus the white, the men versus the old, Republicans versus Democrats, heterosexuals versus homosexuals. Everything that we can think of to separate and divide all of us who really need to be working together, we're divided in why? Why? What if we overcome this and we don't allow those differences to be differences? We just respect everybody and appreciate those differences for what they are. What if we criminalize behavior worth criminalizing, but when we criminalize it, we leave for a place for true rehabilitation? Prison is the punishment. You shouldn't be punished in prison. Prison is the punishment. That's the removal from society to teach you how to act, to go back into society. I'm not just talking about these prison walls that we have, but I'm talking about these prisons that we have inside of our schools, these prisons that we have inside of our communities. We have to learn how to work with people and not just punish. I'm not talking about excusing any behavior. I'm talking about accepting full accountability. But if we accept accountability, if we want them to accept accountability, then everybody else must accept accountability in what's going on. So when you're talking about how can I access quality mental health care, what I want you to think about is just everybody needs mental health. We all go through that continuum of illness to wellness. We have to keep an eye on ourselves. I'm playing with David about walking up the steps, but I ask you, how many of you regularly exercise? How many of you eat properly, especially with the hours that you have? How many of you exercise? How many of you eat right? How many of your home lives are in the order that you want them to be? I want you to think about those little things, because if you as the helpers are hurt, how can you help the people who you're served and elected to help? So mental health is a spectrum that affects everybody. Now, when we start to look at certain populations, we got to understand that they're going to go through different dilemmas that everybody else isn't going to. So when we do see those differences, what we have to do is respect them. We got to remember that something that's different is not automatically a deficit. Just because it's different doesn't mean it's a deficit. So we want to get them care in which they can help. The mental health care cannot just be from psychology. It has to be a total society. It has to be a mind, body, and soul, complete, whole situation. So we're talking about healthy foods that we can eat, healthy schools that we can go in, healthy communities that we can live in. So if we want to access mental health care, that's the everyday situation. How can we help our parents with jobs? Because we understand what poverty does. We understand what it does to the morale. We understand what it does to opportunities. We talk about nurture, all of those things there. But then I want you to think about this. How can we all work together? Because the truth of the matter is this, and we say it within all of our lives. The great axiom, united we stand, divided we fall. And that's what we're doing right now as a nation. And it's getting worse. What we have to do is recognize this. If you really want to adequately solve a problem, you know what the first step is? You got to know what the real problem is. And unfortunately, we don't know what it is. And if you don't know what the problem is, you solve it all other things that might have temporary solutions, but don't have the end result. But once we figure out what the real problem is, and the problem is the division. We're fighting against each other where we need each other. There's an old saying by Edward Burke. The only thing it takes for evil to triumph is for good men and women to do nothing. Henry David Thoreau said that most men have this disenchanted, disenfranchised, disquieted heart because we take our song to the grave. Meaning we knew it was work to do and we didn't do it because we were afraid. We always talk about our Constitution, our amendments. But what was the 18th Amendment? What was it dealing with? Come on. Thank you. I like that word. What was the 21st Amendment? The repeal. From 1920 to 1933, you know why Prohibition came apart? Because they said this alcohol is tearing up our country. These men are getting drunk. They're not coming home. They're not working. It's a scourge on our society. It's unchecked. They stopped it. And then what happened? People still was making it. People still was drinking it. It's about the money. So, 13 years later, from 1920, 1933 to 21st, where they repealed Prohibition. Cigarettes. No, they don't cause. They don't cause cancer. They're highly correlated, but it doesn't cause. How many of you have internal fortitude to stand up against these agencies that we know are wrong? I'm not talking about banning all alcohol. I'm talking about moderation of things, about doing things that's really right. Have you ever wondered, I never get this, if the speed limit is 55, 65, 70, why do they make cars to go 120, 130? Have you ever thought about that? Because they count on us to not have the control and the discipline. You go to, like I said, when my dad worked at Ramel Smith, they had these little carts that they would ride around, forklifts. No matter how hard you pressed on that pedal, one going more than 5 miles an hour, because they understood what could have happened to that business. Why can't we put, I'm not talking about restraints on the people that's neo-fascist, communistic, but I'm talking about the restraints that we need to help us. Marijuana is a Schedule I drug, but cocaine is a Schedule II drug. What do you think about this? Marijuana, even though it's approved in some states for recreation and medical, still Schedule I on the drug charts. Schedule I means it has no medical use and it's very, very addictive. Schedule II means it has prescriptive use, but can be kind of dangerous. Can be addictive. Well, cocaine is on there. You know what else is on there? Ritalin and Adderall. Those are the main two medications, the methylphenidate and amphetamine, that they give young children that have ADHD. When we think about disorders, you hear ADHD, you hear bipolar, you hear depression, which is unipolar. Then maybe you hear something like autism. All of these things are spiking up. Why? It's a combination of all of those things that I talked about. The foods that we're eating, the CDC, unchecked with some of the vaccines that we're going in. We think about the foods that we eat, we think about the things that we ingest illegally, and the things that we're allowed to ingest legally, but we know are not good. But it benefits somebody. We talk about the problem, finding the problem. Capitalism inherently is evil. If you have conscious capitalism, I think it's beautiful. That's when everything is on a fair scale. Anybody in here ever heard of a salary cap? There's only so much money LeBron James can make, as great as he is. You know why? Because it was a time where these owners were paying these players an ordinary amount of money. They said, you know what, hey, this league will not survive if we do this. So they put a cap on their salary. If you're the greatest, you can get to the max. There's no salary cap in America. They said, oh, it's socialism, it's communism. Talking about sustaining a society. When you have less than 2/10 of the top 1% that own close to 40% of the wealth, that's dangerous. Now, if they did it legally, and they did it in a moral fashion, you have to tip your hats off to them. But we know it's not. And if you all who are in these positions to help us don't have the internal fortitude to say something's wrong, then we're in trouble. And I'm talking about the type of informal test too, where you say, like a Gandhi, like a Malcolm X, like a Martin Luther King, like a Patrick Henry. Give me liberty, give me death. I'm willing to give my life for this. As an elected official, when you take that oath, I expect really for you to say, you know what? I'm willing to die for this. Literally. But nobody wants to die, but maybe you have to sacrifice your career because now they call you crazy. Now they say, oh, you're not willing to go along, or you're trying to change the system too much. Well, if we're not willing to do this, then what are we really here for? Because if we're really here to serve the people, we have to ask. We always try to put things in silos. Mental health is not just mental health, it's physical health, it's emotional, it's a mind, body, and soul entity. So when we start looking at one thing just to fix one thing, we've already missed the boat. It's everything in totality. It's everything in totality. So I ask the question to you. What are you willing to do to really help all of the people who you serve? Not just mental health, but health in its totality. And I know I took all of my time talking it there, but if there's any question, I'd be more than happy to accept questions. In an answer period, I do have cards if somebody would like to get in contact afterwards or ask questions in more detail with that. Any questions at this time?